ก็วันสุดท้ายนี้เราก็มีเนื้อหาเข้มข้นสำหรับผู้ที่สนใจไม่ว่าจะเป็นผู้ที่กำลังเริ่มหรือผู้ที่เริ่มมาแล้วแต่อยากจะพัฒนาศักยภาพรวมถึงผลงานให้โดดเด่นมากขึ้นวันนี้ต้องขอต้อนรับทุกท่านด้วยสำหรับคนไทยที่ไฟแรงมากๆแล้วก็เป็นคนรุ่นใหม่ที่สนใจในเรื่องของเทคนิคแล้วก็เวิร์กช็อปต่างๆซึ่งวันนี้วันสุดท้ายเราก็ได้นำวิทยากรนะคะท่านมาให้ความรู้ถึง3เซสชันด้วยกันในหัวข้อแรกนี้เราจะพูดคุยเรื่องของเทคนิคการใช้แสงสีในคอมพิวเตอร์กราฟิกนะคะซึ่งเราจะเห็นกันทั่วไปว่าในปัจจุบันนี้หนังที่เราได้ชมกันนะคะบางคนคิดว่าอาจจะเป็นสถานที่จริงหรือเปล่าหรือใช้คอมพิวเตอร์กราฟิกวันนี้เราจะมีวิทยากรมาให้ความรู้กันอย่างกว้างขวางแล้วก็เต็มที่ใครที่มีคำถามท่านสามารถเก็บไว้แล้วก็ถามช่วงท้ายกันได้ด้วยนะคะ so once again good morning Ladies and gentlemen, welcome you to the last day for the day 3 of Bangkok International Digital Content Festival 2014. And this session, we would like to welcome for distinguished speaker who came from Paris. Are you from Paris? Yes, because he like to share for experience for lighting technique in computer graphic world. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Francois. ปรบมือต้อนรับ Mr. Francois ด้วยนะคะ
Thank you. Thank you. So my name is Mael Francois. I used to be a technical director at Framestore in the UK in London and Pixar Animation Studios for about 5 to 6 years. I've worked on such projects as Toy Story 3, Cars 2, Brave, Monsters University. And today I wanted to talk to you about a bit of lighting and how light works and behaves in the CG world. So first of all, sorry about the accent. I'm French, so I don't speak English without an accent. If you have any questions or if you don't understand me at one point, please raise your hand, ask your question. Don't hesitate to interrupt me. So what we're going to do today is have a look first at how light behaves to see how we can reproduce its behavior in CG. And then we are going to have a look. It's not going to be a very technical talk. It's mostly going to be about how directors of photography or artists are using light and image composition to bring their message, to bring their ideas into the screen. So we are going to have a look at pictures from movies, some CG, some animation, some live action movies, to see how the images are being constructed, how they're being shaped, and how we can use some of the visual tools that we have to make sure that the audience sees exactly what we want to see. So first, we are going to have a small talk about the practical analysis of light. What is light, how it does interact with matter, what is a shadow, light bounce. We are going to have a quick look about colors, just so we are all on the same page and we talked about the same principles. And then we're going to talk about how to use light in pictures. So first, what are the visual goals of lighting? How to direct the eye so that your audience, the people you want to have a look at your image, see exactly what you want them to see. How to use tools. There is a set of tools in lighting, mostly visual tools, to be used to achieve these principles. And what are the main visual principles? So first, here is a phrase that I like. It was one of the TD at Pixar who said that once time. Light is the natural agent that stimulates sight and makes things visible. The purpose and the goal of lighting is not to make the image beautiful. Its first and only purpose is to make sure that you see exactly what you want to see. You show exactly to your audience what you want them to see. If you can make it beautiful on top of it, it's better. But the first purpose of lighting is to make sure that you and your audience are seeing exactly what you want them to see. So first, I'm going to talk a bit about how light does interact with matter. The only way we see light is because of the way it bounces around and because of the way we show matter, the way that the objects are being shown in lighting. So I am going to divide most of the light properties into two sections. I know that there is a lot of way to speak, especially in 3D softwares. Like we have diffuse, subsurface, specular, reflection, refractions. I'm only going to speak about two particularities for me. which are the specular reflection and the diffuse reflection. You have to understand that light is only doing one thing. It's bouncing on top of an object. So this is why I speak always about reflection. The light reflects on top of an object. There is two ways that light can be said to be bouncing off an object. The first is what we call specular reflection. So in CG, sometimes we use both specular and reflection, but you have to know that in the real world, they are just one of the same. So I'm only going to speak about specular reflection and bring them all into one name. And then we have diffuse reflection. Diffuse reflection is mostly to give matter its shape, its color, its texture. Specular reflection is mostly when the light bounces so clearly on top of an object that you can see the outside environment. So the specular reflection is very simple. It's like a mirror. The light is coming from one angle and it's bouncing at exactly the same angle, and you can see exactly the same thing. So you don't see the object's color, you don't see the object's particularity. What you see is the environment, is the light source above and around the object. So for example, we have like chromes, you have car paints, you have metals, a mirror. Any of these objects can be said to use most of specular reflection. Water as well, any oily surface, water, oil, any paint, any varnish will mostly use specular reflection. You don't really see the object's color, you mostly see what's being reflected on top of it. So we have a very good example here with an astronaut's face fan. And then you have diffuse reflection. So for me, the main difference between specular and diffuse reflection comes for the surface's roughness. If you have a perfectly smooth surface, you will have a specular reflection because the light is bouncing at exactly the same angle in every direction. So that's why you can see, like a mirror, you can see what's happening around here. Like Mercury is a very good example for specular reflection because it's always smooth. Whatever things you can do to it, it's always smooth because it's liquid. When you're starting to have a more crafted object or any natural object, its surface will not be perfectly smooth. It will be irregular. You will have bumps and crevices. And then when looking at a very close shape, when the light is coming onto this object, it will start bouncing in about every direction because you have all these small bumps. So because the light is bouncing in every direction, you will not see a perfect reflection, but you will see the light being spread over the object. So this is where you are starting to see the object's texture, the object's material, and its color. So for example, here we have a road. It's completely dry, and as you know, a road is like, it's a lot of very small imperfections. So that's why you can see the road's textures, and we can see the yellow and white bands on the side. But if I were to take the same roads on the watery day, on a raining day, I am removing most of its imperfection because I am adding a layer of water on top of it. So as the road is smoother because of the water, I am starting to see the environment and the sky reflection on top of it. So this is mostly why I speak about diffuse and specular reflection. The main difference between the two is only the roughness of the surface. So we have a very good example here. We have a very dry surface. We have exactly the same surface, but wet and damp. So this is why we have the two differences. On the dry surface, we have all the imperfections, so we can see the texture. On the wet surface, we have the water has kind of smoothed all the imperfections. So this is why we can see all the above reflections. It's the same on the plane. Metal has kind of it's almost smooth, but it has this very, very small, very neat imperfection that makes it partially reflective. So this is why on the plane we have both textures and reflection. But there is one always a balance to be achieved between the two, and this is what I think where most people, and especially in video games, have the most difficulties. When you're using a BRDF shader or any shader that will try to reproduce the light behavior, that will try to reproduce a material real-life behavior, there is always a balance to be achieved between the amount of diffuse reflection and the amount of specular reflection. The first relationship is that the more specular reflection you have, the less diffuse reflection you have. It's very simple because if you have more specular reflection, it's because your surface is smooth, so you don't see its texture. But if you start to have a rough surface, like from left to right, you are losing most of the specular reflection and you are bringing up the diffuse reflection. So by bringing up the diffuse reflection, you are bringing up the object's color and its texture. So you can see from left to right that we have a perfectly smooth surface, so that's like a metal ball or a mercury ball. And as we decrease the surface smoothness, as we add imperfection to the surface, we are losing. So we are first losing the specular reflection intensity, because as we are losing its energy to bring it back to the diffuse, we see less of the reflections and more on the diffuse, but the reflections are getting blurrier and blurrier as well. So if you want to do a realistic shader, you have to think that if you want to have diffuse and texture, you have to blur the reflection very heavily, you have to decrease its intensity, and you have to do that the other way around when you are working on a perfectly smooth surface. So some objects, like I don't think we have anyone here. Oh yeah, maybe that, but it's white. So why most of the objects are only using one or two of these properties, specular reflection or diffuse reflections. In some occasions, you can have objects using both of them. For example, when you look at a leaf, you have the leaf itself, so the light is bouncing all over the leaf. The leaf is imperfect, so you can see its texture, you can see its color. But over the leaf, you always have this kind of small oily and small watery material, which will make it shine a bit. So if you have a look at here, we can see the leaf's texture, but we can also see small, very small specular reflections. And the same happens if you look at this board here. It's white because you can, like, it's very rough, so you can see its color, but it has a small layer of varnish on top of it, which allows some very precise specular reflection to happen on top of it. And if we go back a bit, it's the same for a car paint. If you look at a car paint and if you think about it, a car painting is an assembly of layers. Basically, you have one layer giving you the color, and you have one layer giving you a varnish to protect it. So the colored layer will give you your car texture. If you have any inscription on it, it will give you the car's color, while the varnished one will give you these very sharp, very precise reflections. But you have to think of it as two different materials, one on top of each other. It's not the same material. If you were to have like a rough car and only see the color, you will have a very, very diffuse specular reflection. So if you want to achieve this kind of shader in CG, and you think about it as two different shaders, one on top of each other, you will have the first shader with a very small reflection, very diffuse, very blurred, but still have a small reflection, and on top of it you have a varnished layer with a very sharp reflection. So always thinking about balance between the two layers helps to always think that the more diffuse reflection we have, the more blurred the specular reflection is, and the more precise and sharp the specular reflection is, the less of the object's own texture and color we'll see. So that was just a quick talk just to resume it. Light also, one of the big properties of light that we are going to use are shadows. And when we speak about shadows, most people tend to say that shadows are colored, but in real life, there is no color to shadow. A shadow is just the pure absence of lighting. If you have one light and you have one object in front of it, you will just have like a black patch. There is no colored shadow. If you think of a color shadow like these guys, the color doesn't come from the fact that the shadow is colored. The color comes from the fact that we have two light sources. There is one light source, which is the sun, and another light source, which is the sky. On the bright areas, we have the two light sources being added together. So we have the sunlight plus the skylight. But as the sunlight is way much stronger than the skylight, we only see the sunlight. But in this shadowed area, we have removed the sunlight, so the only effect that we see is the skylight. So you will have to think that when you are doing lighting, when you are composing an image, what's bringing up the color is not to have a colored shadow. It's always to have another light bringing up the color. If you start adding color to your shadows, you will have very surreal or very illustrative but not realistic results. So always think about when you want to bring some life, when you want to bring some textures into your shadows because they are too dark. Most of the time, adding a light will always do the trick, and it will help to blend colors together. Even on a black and white image, even though we don't have, like we have these very sharp and very dark shadows, there is still some density into it because we have some kind of a field light coming from the sky that's still bringing up some details in it. If I only had selected a gray shadow for that, it would have been flat and wouldn't have worked very well. But by just having a second light, in this case the skylight, bringing up some texture, bringing up some detail into my shadows, I avoid to have the flatness that can be brought by just texturing my shadows. So a third light property is the light bounce. When you have light coming into a room, we are in a pretty big room, so it's not very visible here, but in this example, we have one light source. The main light source is coming from the left window, and it's a sunlight, and when the sunlight hits whatever it's happening inside, the light starts bouncing around. You have to think of lighting as a series of bouncing. Most of the time, when the light is bouncing around, it's just bringing up detail. It's bringing up life to whatever is happening to your environment. So when light moves through space, it loses its intensity, it loses its energy. So when we are doing several bounces of lighting around a closed space, every bounce is less intense than the previous one. As you can see, we have the light coming from the sun. So it's very bright in this area because it's hitting the sun directly. I'm going to use that, it's going to be easier. Over here, so we have the direct light hitting the floor, so it's very bright. So the light is coming this way, and then it starts to bounce around in all directions. But when it bounces around, some of the light has been absorbed by this material, by these objects. It has been absorbed and sent back to you, and this is why you can see the object's color. But by being absorbed and starting to bounce around, it will lit the other objects. But as you can see, it's losing its intensity with each bounce, and then we have a first bounce here, lighting up the ceiling, and we have a second bounce starting to light up the walls and the interiors, and then we have third and fourth bounces, but you cannot really see the results of them because it's very small. When light travels, it loses energy and intensity at every bounce, but also depending on the distance that it travels. So as we can see here on this bounce here, like we have the intensity is brighter very close to the window than further away. And the reason is simple, is that the more distance light travels, the more energy it loses. So when you are further away from a light source, it's less brightly lit. So that's why at every bounce, the light loses energy because of the objects. It takes the object's color, and then it loses again energy because of the distance it travels. Where we can see on the wall here that the bounce coming from these guys is losing its energy and it's decreasing in intensity. So most of the time when you are lighting an interior scene like this one, when I did this scene first, you start by adding your main key light. In this case, we have the sun on the left and the sky on the right. And then you start to add bounces. Most of the time when doing interior or exterior lighting, because of the way that light loses its energy, you don't need to have or to use a lot of bounces. You have to think that each and every bounce is going to require twice the amount of computing times than the previous one. So for example, in this case, I have 2 bounces for the light, just because the third and the fourth one would have used a lot of computing times. It might have doubled my render times, but I wouldn't have seen the result because each bounce is less brighter than the previous one. You see its results less and less clearly. So when we used to work at Pixar, most of the time we used only 1 bounce and maybe 2 in some extreme cases. So most of the time when I do CG, I see a lot of people cranking up the number of bounces into the global illumination or anything and using like 8 or 10 bounces for their images. But most of the time you can achieve 98% of the same result with only 1 to 2 bounces. So my golden rule is that when you are doing a daylight exterior scene, 1 bounce is always enough. When it's a daylight interior scene, 1 bounce can be enough, 2 bounces are good, and if it's a night scene, always 2 bounces. But more than that, you might never see the difference. So most of the time when you are working like with Mental Ray, V-Ray, or Arnold, Rent-A-Man, you don't need to crank up the number of bounces. Most of the time, by just starting to use 1 and maybe 2, it's enough, but never start by just plugging all 8 or 10 of them at once. Then I would like, yeah.
How many bounces for a night scene again? How many bounces do you use for a night scene?
Yeah, for a night scene, normally it's 1 bounce for a daylight and exterior or interior, and maybe 2 bounces for a day or night light interior. The reason for the second bounce is that, for example, if you compare the moonlight compared to the sunlight, the moonlight is very dim, it's very small. So just having the second bounce might help not to have completely black areas. But with the sunlight is so strong that the first bounce most of the time will bounce everywhere and just fill up the dark areas. So most of the time that's what I do. 1 bounce for sunlight or very bright lights and 2 bounces for very dim lights. But I never go above that. I tried a few times to have 3 or 4 bounces. There is always a small difference, but you have to pay a render price for that. So most of the time it's not very useful. And at Pixar, I think that we did only 1 movie with 2 bounces, and that was Monsters University. For all the other movies, and I'll show you some images, there is either no bounces at all or 1 bounce at most. Yep. Any other questions? Okay. So we're very quickly to talk about color. So the purpose of all these kind of, I know that most of you guys might know about light already. It's mostly so that we use the same words for the next part. So lighting is what is going to bring you color, and the main reason that you can see color for an object is because light itself is composed of color. Light is a series of wavelengths. You have long wavelengths and very short wavelengths. The longer the wavelength is, the more reddish your color will be. The shorter your wavelength is, the more bluish your colors will be. So this spectrum is what is going to give you the light color. And you can think of wavelengths as kind of a Doppler effect. If you shorten the wavelengths, you will have a more bluish light. If you widen your wavelengths, you will have a redder light. So the light can be thought as a prism of colors. So you have only most of the time a combination of 3 colors from red, green, and blue, and these can be spread out depending on their wavelengths. So as we have seen before, the longer wavelengths will be refracted differently than the shorter ones. So when you use a prism like that, you will start to see the whole light spectrum being spread in front of you, and that's useful to know because when you do, for example, a underwater scene, you can think of the light as being refracted differently. So you will have the red light being not refracted at all, and the blue light being way more refracted. So this is why we will start to have some chromatic aberrations. The light color most of the time is being described by using temperature, color temperature. If we think of the 3 light components that we spoke about, the red, green, and blue part, we see that when we are using lighting, when we are reproducing lighting, for example, in this room, we have these bright spotlights, we have neon lights. There is some neon lights there as well. All of these lights are being spoken of as having a light temperature, and the temperature is what is going to give the light its color. Sorry. So when you look at this spectrum, you have the very high light temperature and the very low light temperatures. All these values are based on the values of the sun at midnight. At noon, at midday. There is no sun at midnight. The sun at midday is being to be considered a pure white. So what we're going to say is that the sun, as being a pure white, will have a color temperature around 5,500 degrees, and this is in Kelvin degrees. So this is the white area that we see here. Now, if we increase or if we lower the color temperature of our light, we will start to bring color to our lighting. So for example, I don't know if you see it, but we have 2 big examples right there. We have these spotlights on the ceiling. They have a very low color temperature. These guys might be around 2000, maybe 1800 or 2000 degrees Kelvin, which will bring them into this area of the spectrum. So this is why these lights are more of a brownish, yellowish color. But I don't know if you see it right there. There is a very bright spotlight, made like an LED light, a neon light with a very high color temperature. So maybe around 8 or 9,000 degrees. So which brings it into this area of the spectrum, and this is why these lights are blue. So you have to think of it that the only way to generate an artificial lighting is to use this spectrum. And the only color that you will be able to have will be to have colors being spread on this spectrum. So you can see that we can only have lighting coming from the red or yellow to the blue ones and coming through white lighting. If you look at the full spectrum of all the colors that we can have, we cannot have a green light and we cannot have a purple light, because the light spectrum doesn't allow us to do that. The only way to have these colors is to add either a filter, like a light filter in front of it. For example, if we want to have a pink or yellow light, we can just take a white light and add a pink or yellow sheet or a purple sheet in front of it, and it will give it some color. or we can start playing with chemical elements. The only lights that are not going to follow the spectrum and are going to allow you to use every part of the light colors are LED lights. But if you look neon, tungsten, or any form of very bright lighting that is not LED, you will never be able to have these colors, which is why in photography we always use light filters or light paste to add color in front of a lighting. If you use LED, you'll be fine. You can reproduce any color. But if you wanted to reproduce the lighting conditions in this area, the lighting conditions in this environment, you will just have to measure the light temperature for every source here and reproduce it in CG, and you would be fine because you will be following the spectrum. And it's the same for an outdoor lighting. The sunlight is always going to be at a maximum of 5,500 degrees. And as the sun comes down, up or down towards the horizon, its light temperature will decrease, so we'll have a more reddish color to the sunlight. The skylight is the exact opposite. At noon, the skylight above you is always white, and as you move, as you decrease the sun's color, the skylight temperature will increase as well, so you will have a more bluish sky. So this is what I talked about. Light is mostly composed of three colors, red, green, and blue, and when you add them on top of each other, this is when you can have color. So this is a very important part for me. When you think about color, what gives you the color is not the object's color, it's the light color. You have to think as an object or a material as not having a color by itself. It is just the way that the lighting bounces on top of it that will give you the color. So for example, here we have this white cube, and just seeing that the cube appears to be white because it reflects the lighting in all wavelengths. It doesn't absorb much of the light. It bounces exactly the same amount of red as the same amount of green as the same amount of blue, which is why it appears to be white. But if we have an object that will absorb most of the blue and green light, the blue and green wavelengths of the light, and mostly bounce the lower wavelengths, the red part, we will see the object as being red because the only light bouncing off this object and coming back towards us is the red part. So an object isn't red because it has a red color. It is red because it only bounces back the red part of the lighting. And it's going to be the same for every other color. The black cube will absorb most of the lighting in all wavelengths. The blue one will absorb the green and red component. The green one will absorb the blue and red component. And all the other ones will they will send you, if you have a yellow one, it will absorb part of the blue, well, most of the blue, but only part of the red and green. If you had a purple one, it will absorb most of the green and part of the red and blue. So this is always a mix of the three, but you always have to think of your object colors as the light being bounced on top of it. And this is important because your light color will have a big influence on that. For example, if you have an object that's mostly supposed to bounce, like the red cube, that's mostly supposed to bounce off the red component of your lighting, and you have a pure blue lighting on top of it, your object will be black. It will not be purple. And this is where it's sometimes difficult to add realistic objects in CG. If you have a blue light without any red or green component, and you have an object with a purely red material, this object should appear black because your light doesn't have any red component, so there is no reason why your red material should appear. So you always have to keep into balancing when you are lighting, when you are doing shading, that your light color is as important as your object's color, and which is why sometimes you have to trick a bit when you are using, for example, a moon lighting, which is usually used as a blue light because of the Hollywood way of doing it. If you have red objects, in CG, all your red objects will appear purple because in CG, light is just an addition of components. But in real life, you have to think that all of your red objects will be almost black. So when doing lighting in CG, you might have to adjust all of your red materials to take into account the fact that your lighting is blue, so all of your red materials should be almost black. And this is when you are going to have more realistic results. So now that we have talked a bit about lighting, I want to go to the kind of for me, the important part for this session, which is how to use light in pictures. This is, again, a sentence that I like. It is one thing to make a picture. It is another to capture the attention of the spectator and to hold its interest. For me, the important part in this sentence is the term attention and interest. As I told you before, the goal of lighting is not to make beautiful images. The goal of lighting is to make efficient images. The goal of lighting is to make sure that even if you have a shot or if you show an image to somebody for half a second, the person you are showing this image to is going to see exactly what you want them to see. So for example, if you are showing a person an image of a kitten in a room for half a second and you have a fully brightly lit room, the person might not see that, okay, there is a cat there. But if you have a dark room with a projector, the person will see the cat at once. So this is the main purpose of lighting. If you can make an image beautiful on top of it, that's even better. But if an image is just beautiful but not efficient, it will not work. So as I told you, the main purpose of lighting first is to direct the eye, to direct your audience or the spectator's attention so that they see exactly what you want them to see. The second purpose of lighting is to support story emotion. This is very important as you are not going to light a love scene as an horror movie. I think that if we are going to light any one of the Aliens movie with pink lighting, it will not work very well. And the same goes the other way around. The third purpose of lighting is to maintain continuity. Continuity is the purpose of when we have a series of shots or when an action is happening somewhere, that we make sure that there is a wire, that there is a continuity between them, that by having the lighting, I make sure that I'm using the same colors, I'm using the same environment, I'm using the same mood, I'm using the same storytelling principle so that every sequence and every scene fits together. I'm not going to light the first shot green, the next one pink, the next one as at nighttime, and the one afterwards as a daytime. And then, as I told you, the last and fourth principle of lighting is just to add beauty. But you have to do them in this order. First, to direct the attention. Second, to support the story. Third, to maintain continuity. And only then can you add lighting. Can you add beauty to your image. So first, to direct the eye, there is a few different ways to do that. There is the way that we can organize the elements in the image. There is the way that we can create a focal point, that we can create a place in the image where the attention will be focused on. To establish a hierarchy, so to say, okay, we want to see this actor first, we want to see this actor secondly, and then we want to see whatever is third. We can create planes on massing, which will give us depth. We can make sure that the action is readable. If you work with animators and they have spent crazy amount of hours doing an animation work, and you mess up everything with lighting by, for example, putting their characters into shadows, they might not like you very much, and you want to make sure that whatever they are doing in animation reads correctly onto the screen. And then third, one of the goal and one of the tools for that is to minimize distraction. If there is anything that's not important into your image, you can put it into shadow. You can add like a very dark color on top of it, so just to make sure that we don't see it very much. So for that, we are going to use a series of tools and visual principles. So we are going to see how in movies color is used, how the value is used, or we can use lines, shapes, and textures to make sure that we have all these principles at the ready. So color is obvious. This is how we are going to use the different either lighting or objects color. Value is going to be the intensity. And line is how we are going to construct lines or series of lining objects. Shapes is how we are going to use symbolism. So for example, what if we use round shapes, square shapes, triangle shapes. And then texture is mostly the color of the object itself. So for each one of these tools, we are going to see how to emphasize, how to use contrast, how to balance, how to have a correct proportion, and how to use rhythm. Unity is the way of using all of these principles at once. So first we're going to see on the lighting tool, so color is the hue, saturation, and brightness. Value is the lightness and darkness of an area. The line is an actual existing light or an implied mask, and the shape is an area of mass or different shape of an object. So we'll see that. So first we're going to see how to use the lights and how to use color to direct the light and the action. So we're going to have a look at different images from a series of movies. Just quick notes, I think that Steven Spielberg is one of the best directors and directors of photography in the world, so I'm going to use a lot of examples from his movies because he is always composing the image at the best and very perfectly has a use of texture, a use of color, a use of image composition. So for example, this is a scene from AI. Just one quick thing. Sometimes I'm going to use symbolism when talking about some of these subjects, and because of my culture, I'm mostly going to explain Western symbolism, but there is a thing that you guys can take from that and adapt it to your culture. For example, I think that maybe square, rounds, or triangular shape might not mean the same thing between the West, between Asia, between Africa or South America, but the principles are the same. What we're going to have a look here is mostly how to use the your countries or your tradition to make sure that we use the same symbolism. So in my case, I'm going to speak about Western symbolism and sometimes Christian one because that's the one that most of the Western civilization is being based on. So in this one, we have, in terms of color, we can see that there is a lot of things happening in this image. We have 3 actors. They're on a boat, on a small pond. There is a teddy bear, and we have all these leaves in the front. So this is a scene from AI, and when you look at the scene is very efficient to make sure that you see exactly what the director wants you to see. In this sequence, the main center of action is the mother, because the mother is, this is a flashback, the mother is going to tell a story to her 2 kids. And she is the main center of action, but she's also the main center of emotion, because it's by her that the rest of the story will happen. So to make sure that in this shot, which is very short in the movie, we see exactly the actor that we want to see first, we see that while most of the image is kind of has green and yellow shades, the mother is the only character being dressed in red. So by having this emphasis on the red color, we see that the mother kind of pops out. She, just by having her in a red dress in this green environment, makes sure that there is a big contrast, and we create an emphasis, and we say to the audience, okay, this is what I want you to see. We have this big array of color, and just having a small part of a different color in this example of a complementary color will make sure that whoever is going to have a look at this picture is going to look at the mother first. And then Spielberg is going to use different tools as well that I'm going to describe very quickly to make sure that, okay, she's in red, but we really want to make sure that she's the one that we see. So for that is using other tools. The second tool is that she's holding a book, and the book has a white cover. The way that the book is lit, as you can see, there is no reason why the book would be so bright. The book is being lit as kind of a white square. And when you have a white square into a fuller area, the square will draw attention as well. It's because it's human. It's part, I don't know if you ever heard of the Gestalt theory. It's mostly part of, if you have a very simple geometric structure with a flat color in a fully different environment, this is the structure that will grab your attention. So first we have the mother in red. There is a white square in front of her, so we make sure that the attention stays here. There is also a light bouncing inside of the book to make sure that we see her face, because the sunlight is behind them. They are being lit from backwards. But what's important for the story emotions is her face, what she's looking like when telling this story. So we make sure that we have a nice light bounce from the book lighting her face. And then we're just using going to add other lines. Like there is a line being created here to make sure that, okay, she's in red, we have the white square, we have the bounce on her face, and we have this direct line showing her face as well. This is directing the eye towards us as well. And as for the kids, they are either hidden behind the book or in a very neutral color, like a gray color, because they are not more important than her. She is the important part into this shot. So this is why she's being lit this way. So again, what's important here is the story and the emotion. They managed to have a beautiful image on top of it, but the image is efficient in its own way. This is another scene from AI. So I like this scene for the way that it uses color contrast. I don't know if any of you have seen the movie, but basically in the movie, between these two characters, the left one is a human, the right one is a robot. So, but he's a robot looking like a human. So what they are going to do in this movie is to make sure that humans and robots are being lit differently. The only robot that's not going to be lit like a robot but like a human is one of the kids that we have seen before. But in this case, we want to make sure that we know that Jude Law is a robot. So in order to do that, a very simple use of color and color contrast is very efficient. If you look at the environment, we could think that the environment is doing whatever you should never do, which is bring a lot of bright and very colorful elements. But it's very efficient because the environment is going to use blue and green colors, which are cold or reminiscent of a synthetic or artificial material, and a lot of very bright and warm colors like yellows and reds, which we can link to a more natural and can link to the flesh or more natural or human or animals. So what they are going to do is that, as you can see, most of the most of the warm elements are around the robot. Like we have, whoops, I'm going to use that. We have this yellow, I think it's a piano or a bar, but it's very bright yellow. We have this red sofa. We have this very bright yellow lamp and this very big red area and a very warm area on the wall. And we only have this green area here, only this area of cold. Whereas there is a separation here between the right and left side of the image. So the right side of the image mostly has warm colors in the background, whereas the left side of the image has neutral colors or cold colors, but not that much of warm colors. Like we have blues, we have green, but not that much of yellows or red. And the reason is very simple, is that we want to make sure that this character appears like a human and this character appears like a robot. So what we're going to do is that we're going to lit this character with a warm light, so we can see that he has some kind of maybe like a low temperature, like yellowish, reddish light, which will give its skin a lot of life, because if you light a character with a warm lighting, it will give him life, so it make him appear more lively. So this character appears more human. Whereas in the case of Jude Law, he's being lit by a blue lighting and a red lighting, which are synonym of very artificial lights, and is also wearing this kind of very like small greenish shirt and this kind of a leather jacket with a lot of reflection. So by having him having all these synthetic components and being lit by these very cold lights, we make sure that he appears green, and to make sure that he appears even colder, we put him on a very warm background. So we create a contrast between a warm background and a colder character, which will make sure that this character appears as synthetic. We can't believe that he's a robot. Whereas for this guy, it's the exact opposite. We have a warm character on a cold background or neutral background, which will make sure that he appears warmer. So we create a contrast between this guy and this guy just by playing with lighting. And this contrast is being used to make sure that in the story we understand that this guy is a robot, he's not human, but this guy is human. And then to make sure that there is a difference, that they are part of two different worlds, we draw a big vertical line to cut the image in two, and to make sure that, okay, we have two worlds here. We have the human world and we have the robot's world. So again, this is a very nice composition of image. This image is from Amelie. And for me, it's a very nice and very subtle way of using color balance. Why balance? If you use a lot of elements or a lot of principles in one part of the image, you will draw all the attention only to this part of the image, and sometimes you will lose whatever is happening for the rest of the image, or you will lose the dynamism that you might want to have for the next shots. So you might want to avoid that. It's always nice to have some parts of the image which are more important, but you always want to keep some balance between the two. So for example here, this image is doesn't really have any purpose in itself. The only purpose is not the image itself, but the theme it represents. There is no central part to this image. Every element is as important as the next one. The goal of this image is to show that the character, the hero, is kind of a maniac, always putting every object lined up and always like organizing them in the same manner. So there is no reason to have maybe this glass being more important than this one. So what we do is that we have all these empty glasses here, and we have these glasses full of straws. If we only had the glasses full of straws here, we will create an imbalance in the image towards the right, which will not be good because the purpose in the story is to make sure that we'll see everything. So what they do is that instead of having one bright patch of colors, for example, instead of having only green or only red straws, they are mixing them up. So by mixing them up, they kind of neutralize them. They make sure that we keep a balance between the colors. And while we have a balance on the right part of the image, we can see that we need to have a balance on the left part of the image as well, because all the straws are on the right. So if we only have colors on the right part, we'll still have a balance between left and right. So what they do is very simple, is that even though everything here is made of glass, we can see that the empty glasses are way more reflective than the full ones. So by just making sure that we have a reflection on these guys, and we have almost no reflection on these guys, but we have the colors here and the reflection here, we create a balance between the two parts of the images. We have the right part, which is using color contrast and color complementarity to make sure that we give an importance to this area. But the left part, in order to keep a balance with all of these color, is just going to use reflection and to use contrast in values. This part here is kind of flat. We don't have a lot of difference in value. We have a difference in colors, but we don't have a difference in values. This part here has more contrast in values. We have these very bright areas and we have these very dark areas. So having these two strong principles, value contrast and color contrast, being again separated by a vertical line, makes sure that we have a balance in the image. Another principle is to use color proportion. I told you before for the red woman that if you use an element of color, it might draw the eye just by itself, and it might do so even more if this colored element is in an environment that's using its complementary color. So if we look at this image, at first glance, this image is very full. Like, there is a lot of things happening. We have two actors, we have a series of boards, we have all of these computers, these huge windows. And at first, we might be tempted to think that, okay, this is not the correct way to do it, because obviously the main purpose of the image is one of these two guys. The purpose of the image is not the windows. But what they have done here is put a big green light on the window. So I might be tempted to say, okay, it's not the goal, because like these windows, if I have this big patch of green, this is why I might see first, but there is no reason for me to see that because it's not the goal. It doesn't translate any emotion. It's not the story of the image. The story of the image is these two guys. But the DOP on that is very clever, very, very efficient, and very economical. By having these big green windows, he gives a whole tint to the environment. We have a very cold environment. And to make sure that we see at first the actress, what he does is very simple. He just adds one red book here. And by just having this one red book in a totally green environment, we have this big greenish environment which neutralizes itself. Yeah, sorry about the sound. So we have this big green environment, and it kind of neutralizes itself because it's huge. And by just adding a very small patch of red in the middle, we make sure that this is what we are going to see. And this is a very, very big tool. Color proportion is very important. It's the same as if, if you have a very dark environment, like a very black environment, and you have one small spotlight, one small patch of bright area, this is what we're going to look first, to look at first. And it works the same way with color. If we have a big patch of green, we are kind of forgetting the green because it's the main mood. And if we had just one very small area of red in the middle, this is the area that we are going to see. If we had divided the image into maybe having this area red and this area green, they would have neutralized themselves because we will have had the same quantity of red as the same quantity as green. And this will have created a balance, and this will not have helped to have an emphasis to create a focal point of what I want to see. But by voluntarily reducing the amount of red and having this patch here right in front of the actress, I make sure that what the audience is going to look at first is this area. And as you can see, there is no need to do anything more. We can see her. Like, we have looked here, so we can see her. So there is no need to have a spotlight on her. We see this area first. Wow, that's impressive. And then she's the main center of action. She's the focal point, so we don't need to see her much than that. As for him, he will be the only thing moving into the image, so we don't need to add much more lighting to him. We have a bright area of red for her, but she's not moving, but he is. So having these two characters being lit, her this way and he moving but being still a bit in the dark, while creating a focal point here, it still creates a balance between the two characters. The next thing I would like to talk to you about is color rhythm. In all the images that we have seen, there was most of the time one focal point. There was one thing to see. We wanted to make sure that the audience would look at only one thing. In this image from up, we want the audience to look at a lot of things. We have 4 characters. We have Kevin, Doug, Carl, and Carl Jr. So we want to make sure that we look at all the characters. None of the characters is no one of them is more important as the next one. But there is a lot of things happening. We have these characters, we have the jungle behind them, we have Kevin, who is very bright and colorful. But we want to make sure that, okay, we see what's happening here, we see what's happening here, and we see what's happening here. And we also want to make sure that the action is going to move towards the right because the animation is moving towards the right. So we want to make sure that we exit the image this way. So what we do is very simple. We use color rhythm. So first we have a very big and green environment. So as I told you before, if you have a big environment of one color, it kind of neutralizes itself and will be brought to the background. So even though the jungle is very dense, has a lot of detail, by just lighting it and using variation of the same color, we kind of consider it as one object and pull it towards the background. The first area of interest is Kevin's face. This is very simple. First, he's very bright. He's bright on a very dark environment. And we have this circle of white by using his eyes. So we are going to have a look at this area first. So we have these very bright, very colorful, and very saturated colors. So what we're going to do next is we're going to move the eye around this way. So first we can see that we have the tree is directing us to have this dynamic. The tree is directing us first to look at this area. Then the neck curve is making sure that the eye is naturally going to have to do this kind of movement. And to help to this movement, we are going to use the same colors as on the face. You can see that we have the same color here and here, but every time they are a bit darker, and less saturated. Like we have a very bright, very saturated red and yellows, a bit darker and less saturated, and even darker and less saturated. And this is because the next character, the next area of interest is dog. And dog is beige, and beige is a very desaturated yellow. So we are creating this kind of link between the colors here. So we're going to have a look at the colors of whatever is happening on dog. When we are on dog here, we can see that dog himself is very brightly lit. He is lit in a brighter way than Kevin because he has a duller color. Like beige is not a very strong color. It doesn't pop out. So to make sure that we keep a balance between the two elements, he was lit stronger to make sure that he is brighter than Kevin, but he's also less saturated. He has less color. So this is why we can see him nicely. And then Doug is like his body shape is moving towards the right direction, and we have the kid which is playing there, and we can see that again we have the colors, we have the beige, and we again have the same colors being used here. So as you can see, we still have yellows, we still have beige, and he is as brightly lit as Doug. So we create a link, and we make sure that these guys are still in balance with Kevin. And the last character is Carl. So right now we have first area of interest, the focal point here. Then we move to the second focal point, which makes us move to the third focal point. And then we have to find a way to make sure that we see Carl. So the first way to do that is that if you look at Carl, he is the only one having very cold colors. Even though Kevin is blue, he has this it's a very saturated blue, and we have hints of purple and pink into it. Whereas Carl doesn't have any yellows, it doesn't have any oranges or reds. So we create a contrast between the two characters, so the eye will want to go from left to right naturally. Then Carl has these very bright white hairs. So again, we create a contrast which makes sure that we have a look like 1, 2, 3, and 4. And then to create a link to the next shot, Carl is moving towards the right. The action is the next shot is going to be a translation from left to right. So we naturally move the spectator's eye, the audience's eye towards the right, and we create a transition for the next shot. So for this one, I just wanted to talk about symbolism. It's very simple, like nothing special in the lighting in this one, just that we have a green bottle, and like in the West, if you have a green bottle being lit this way, it's poisoned. So the only purpose of having this bottle being lit this way is just to make sure that the audience understands and knows beforehand that this is full of poison and this guy is gonna die. So very simple. We use symbolism, this kind of very bright green in a bottle, and we know that the bottle is poison. We don't need anything else. It suits the story, it supports the story, and we know what's going to happen. So we talked a bit about value in some of the previous images. We're going to see more examples here. So first, value emphasis. So this is a scene from Oliver Twist. Um, there is a lot of action happening into this scene. Like we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 actors, lot of elements, but we want to make sure that the audience understands what's happening. And what's happening is that the main goal is that whatever the judge is saying here. So first, we see that there is apparently only one light source. It's coming from the window, so there is a window here. There might be a window on the right here of screen that's lighting the scene. If you think about what we have talked about before, when we have sunlight in a room like this, the sunlight should bounce everywhere. Like we should have a lot of bright areas in there. When we see the brightness here and we think about the image that I've shown you with the light bounces, we should have a lot of brightness, a lot of bounces everywhere because the sunlight is very strong and it's gonna just bounce and fill the room everywhere. But if we had allowed the light to do that, we would have had a very light, a very filled image, and we might not have the potential to look exactly where we want to look. So what we've done here is that in the corner has been darkened, and the way to do that, so in CG it's easy. You can just put a blocker or anything. And the way to do that in live action is to use some kind of net. It's a net with very, very thin apertures that will block the light partially. So by putting a net behind this guy, even though we don't see the net, we will naturally darken this area. So we have a very bright patch of lighting on a very dark area. So naturally, this is where we are going to have a look first. To increase the fact that we are going to this area, we are using exactly the same trick as in AI. We are using a square of white paper. And this square of white paper will grab the attention as well. So we make sure that we have a lot of contrast with this bright area on the dark one. So we get a first area of contrast. We increase it by having this white square. So we make sure that we see this area. And as you can see, even though it's a white square, we have the clock here. And the clock itself is it's a circle, so a white circle would grab the attention as well. So what they have done is that we don't really see it with this lighting in this room, but in reality the clock is almost half as bright as this piece of paper, just to make sure that we don't have the clock grabbing too much attention. And if you look around, this is the only piece of purely white paper. Even though these guys here, like they are into the sunlight, but these are yellow papers because we don't want these guys to grab the attention too much. We only want this paper to grab the attention. So we have dulled this area. And it's the same for all the characters. They are all wearing very dark clothes, and we make sure that there is no area that might have this kind of bright patch. So we have an emphasis onto this area of action. It's the same principle here. There is one light source. It's coming from the windows. So there is one light source here. There is another one around here. And what we do here is create a contrast. The main center, the main focal point is this guy. So we use contrast in a very efficient way. Even though there is one light source, you will see that the only area of almost pure white are here and here. Why? the first area here of pure white is to make sure that we see the character. You can also see that his face is more brightly lit than any other actor's face, so because he's the main actor, so we want to make sure that we see him first. He's also the only one wearing a white shirt. All the other characters, even though they seem to have white shirts, his is much whiter. These guys seem to have some kind of grayish fabric, or they don't clean it very well. I don't know, but that's... Even though we might have a lot of white here, we have made sure that we don't see it too much, and that the only area of white is in there. So we have created a focal point on his face. So that helps to show the character. And one of the main goals into this shot in the story is for us to understand that he's a very devout person. He's a very devout Christian. So he's reading a Bible here. And again, if you look in the rest of the image, he's the only one having a purely white open Bible. All the other books are closed. So they're all closed. He's the only one having an open Bible, and he's the only one having a piece of white paper. So this will also help on a dark costume to make sure that these two areas of white make sure that we see only this part. And that's the only interesting part in the shot. We don't really care about the rest. The rest is just for the background. Again, from up, to create a balance. If you think about this shot, the light source is coming from the right. So she's lit by a light coming from the window. But if you think about it, there is no reason why his face has to be so bright. Physically, it's not correct. Like, the only reason why his face would be so bright will be if the environment would have been bright. But as you can see, the environment is very dark. And the environment is very dark to make sure that these guys pop out, that we see them. We create a contrast. But they are as important in the story as each other. So even though she's being lit directly by the sunlight, we add a bounce light and a fill light to him to make sure that we see his face as well. Because what's important here in the story is the relationship between these two characters. So you can see that we have created, by balancing the two lights, we have created an area of interest of equal value between the two characters. Value proportion, lots of things happening in this image. The main area of interest, of course, is Tom Cruise and this kid. And there is not really any lighting per se in this image, but one very efficient way of making sure that we see these guys first is that they are in this area. Not only are they the only white people, but they are the ones who have the whiter skin. So again, we create a contrast by putting people with darker skin around the main actor. We make sure that we see him, and like, he is very brightly lit. And to reinforce that, we add this small patch of red. See, we have this red shirt next to the green balloon, next to the blue water, so that will help to create a contrast as well in the colors, so to make sure that we have an interest into this area. Even though we have some spread on red, some red and green spread over the image, this is the only area where we have a contrast for that. And then we are going to use rhythm. As I've explained to you, like we've seen with Kevin, we can create a sequence of looking at the image just by using lighting. So this is again a scene from Oliver Twist. there is a lot of things happening here. We have 6, 8, 9 actors, a table full of dishes, and we want to make sure that we see this guy first and we see this guy last. The reason is that there is a character entering the room, and we want to make sure that we end the shot by exiting, by having the audience view exiting to the left, because this is what is going to create a relationship to the next shot. So the way to do that is that if you look at the characters, like it forms a triangle here. So at the summit of the triangle is this guy. So he's the more important one. So he's the one that all the lines are going to be directed towards to. So he's the one that we're going to see first. He's also the most brightly lit character. So we have more light here than here. So we're going to have a look at this area first. If you look at the environment is very, very, very dark. It's not very realistic or natural, but you don't really care because you want to create a contrast here to make sure that this is the area that we're going to have a look at. So first we have these lines, we have this first area of interest, and if you look here, you'll see that we want to have a look at everybody's faces. So we will have the brighter character on the top, and then we're going to have to lower the brightness. So we have a bright character, a bit of a darker one, darker again, and the darkest of all is this one. So we create a relationship. First, we look here, and then naturally the eye is going to move this way, just for the brightest area to the darkest one for the actors, and naturally we're going to follow is wherever he's looking at. So we're going to create a dynamism, but even though there is a lot of actors there, we're going to have a look at all of them and create a dynamism and a rhythm to exit the image. So we're going to see how we can use lines. So when I speak about lines, it's not always purely lines per se, but it can only be like here we have lines created by just having objects being put in one after another. So it creates a line. So as you can see in the image, we have the perspective is very efficient. Every line here, make it the boys' heads, the dishes, the tables, even here, like the perspective is creating a focal point here. So we have the character of Oliver Twist right in the middle, and all the lines are making sure that we naturally are going to have a look into this area first. So even though we have a look into this area first, we are going to increase the fact that we should look at this character by having this pool of lighting. It's like in a theater. In a theater, if you have a pool of lighting, it shows you where you should look at. So in this case, we know that we should look over there. And I told you about symbolism beforehand. When you have a pool of light being used like that, it's mostly a symbolism in mostly a Christian symbolism, symbolizing God. In Christian scripture, every time God is being symbolized as a pool of light, it always comes from the top left to the bottom right. So we have this pool of light coming this way, and the presence of this kind of a God light is there because Oliver Twist is in a religious establishment. and is an orphan, and the orphanage is being held by nuns. So we can see that we have Christian scripture written onto the walls, and to show that he's in a religious environment, not only have we the pictures, but we're also using Christian symbolism with this pool of God light. And if you have a look at this sequence in the real movie, they push it very, very, very far. I told you about continuity. Right now, the pool of light is coming from the top left to the bottom right. But even in the next shots, when the camera is going to move around the scene, they are still going to break continuity, because this pool of light will always come from the top left. Even when the camera will be looking towards us, the light should be from right to left, but they will keep it in this direction just to make sure that it always works this way. And sometimes breaking continuity like this is very good. If you look at the Lord of the Rings, the first one, when we have the hobbits who are running and we have the Nazguls running behind them at night, you'll see that when we are behind them, the moonlight is in front of them, and they are being lit shapes. And when we move the camera in front of them, the moonlight again moves and is again in front of them, so behind them. So they are always lit from behind, even wherever the camera is, just because in the story it's important just to show their silhouettes. So you don't always have to make sure that the continuity is respected. Sometimes you can break it and it works very well. I wanted to show this image from Minority Report for line contrast. If you use an oblique line like this, you will create a relationship. If you use a vertical line, you create action, or you separate two elements. As we have seen before, we can separate the image in two by having a vertical line. But if you create an oblique line between two characters, you will create a relationship between these two characters. So in this case, we emphasize the fact that Tom Cruise is looking at this guy by having an oblique line. This will help to create a link between the two characters. If you don't want to create a link between two characters, don't use an oblique line. Line balance, so Woody Allen movie. So again, usually in the West, when you have horizontal lines, it kind of gives a sense of tranquility, of quietness, like nothing is going to happen. Whereas when you have vertical lines, it will give a sense of action. So this shot is interesting because it's the in-betweener between two shots which are going to happen in this room. The previous one is a dinner, very quiet, nothing happens. And the next shot is going to be a fight between these two characters. They are going to argue. So to do the transition between a very quiet sequence and a more animated one, Woody Allen uses this composition where we have, again, a vertical line cutting the image in two. The left part reminds us of the shot before with horizontal lines. It was quiet, it was peaceful. And the right part reminds us of the shot to come, of the fight to come. It's only using vertical lines. So by creating this contrast between horizontal and vertical lines, we prepare the audience to have action into the next shot. Yep. Light rhythm, again. We use perspective to emphasize this area and to make sure that we understand that all the action is going towards the back. We have all of these lines repeating themselves, so the eye will be directed in all directions towards this point. Directing the eye with shapes. So I'm mostly going to speak about three forms of shapes. Again, in the West, a square is something symbolizing something that's not going to move. For example, as we've seen in Up, Carl has a very square face. It's because he's stubborn. He's an old guy, he's stubborn, he has a very a dull character, he will not change his mind. So having a square-shaped character or prop will symbolize that this is not going to move easily. If you have a round shape, usually it means that you have a more dynamic element. So kids, for example, we tend to have more rounded shapes. And if you are shooting or lighting an actress, usually you don't want to have too much shadow on her face because you want to have her face appearing as smooth and as round as possible, because women are usually symbolism of dynamism, whereas men are really more square, like with a square jaw, very sharp shadows, because they are more stubborn, more rigid. And then the triangle. In the West, the triangle is a symbolism of power. So usually, when you have a pyramid-shaped triangle, it's a symbolism that there is a power happening there. And if it's an inverse triangle, it's usually a symbolism that there is a power void happening there. So this is a sequence from Elizabeth, so that's representing the Queen of England. And as I told you, the triangle is used as a symbol of power. So this shot in the story happens right after a power struggle between her and all her advisors and all of the other lords in England. She just won the fact that she is the queen, she has the power. So the goal in this shot is to show that she has won, that she is the one in power. So for that, we can see that she is being framed by every form of triangles that they could have thinking of. First, there is the chair. The chair forms a triangle above her. It also forms some kind of it can be a relationship to God, so it helps to have parallel to the fact that she has been chosen by God to be queen. Her hair is in a triangle shape as well. Like her clothes form a triangle from the shoulders, but even from the inside here, even the opening is forming a triangle. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 triangles. And these triangles are placed in the middle of the image. So there is no doubt that she is the one who has power. And to help understand that in the story, the other guys have lost power, you can see that they all have inversed triangles. Like their neck here, they are formed a triangle, but an inversed one. Their hands are forming an inverse triangle as well. And their birds are forming an inverse triangle. So everything on Earth is a pyramid with the top, like the triangle being headed up, and they all have the triangles heading downwards. It's very visible on this guy. Like there is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 triangles heading to the bottom of the image. So in the West again, she's a symbolism of power, and they are a symbolism of people that have lost power. Shape contrast. So as we have seen with, remember this big green room with just a small area of red. Here we have a very grayish color, but the image itself is very flat. It's like we could have made just a pure flat gray. And we have a single shape in the middle, a squared shape, or it's more like a rectangle, but it's still linked to a square shape. Very simple and very dark. So by just having this simple dark shape in a very large and brighter environment, you make sure that you will only see what's happening there. Shape balance. So in the story, the two elements are very important. You have a lord here, and you have his servitor here with the horses. But in the previous shots is what happens to him in the story. But this guy is going to be very important in the upcoming shots for the sequence. So we want to make sure that he's not the only one grabbing all the attention. So what we have is that, again, he's the one in power. He's the Lord. He forms a triangle. He's the one in power. We have a square here. So these guys here represent more like a rigid, like he's giving the orders, and these guys are just following the orders, but they are not going to do anything by themselves. They have a very rigid thinking. But we want to make sure that we keep a balance between the two. So to keep the balance between the two, a triangle is a very strong shape. So we will see it. It will have a stronger meaning than a square shaped. So in order to balance the two, we put the black triangle shape on a slightly darker background than the square one. We have white here and blue here. So we have more contrast here on the less valued shape than on the triangle shape. So it helps to create a balance between the two, and it helps to make sure that not one of these elements is more important than the other one. Shape proportion, again, all these guys have, they are struggling for power, and but none of them is more important as the other one. So we make sure that we repeat exactly the same symbols and the same shapes for every one of these characters. They are not to be considered as separate characters. They are to be considered as a group. So we don't want them to be different. Shape rhythm. You can use shapes. Circles are very, very useful for that. We have seen that we can use lines, perspective, or colors to move from one area of the image to the other. In this one, we just use concentric circles to make sure that what we see, the only area we are going to have a look at, is here. Another thing about this picture is that you remember this is from AI as well, so it's the same mother and the same kid as the one that we have seen in the first image when she's dressed in red in a boat. You remember that in the first image, everything was very warm. She was very warm, she was dressed in red, the kids were there, everything seemed very lively. But in this image, these two guys are being lit only with blue lighting, which gives them this kind of very dull color. And the reason is that, so spoiler alert for those of you who have not seen AI, the kid is gonna die. So that's why we don't want to have him lit with too much of a warm color. We don't want to have him lit by either a yellow or orange lighting. By making sure that everything is blue and that his face is blue as well, we give him this kind of bit of a sick color because he is sick in the story. And it helps to make us understand that he's not feeling well and that he's gonna die. So again, by using cold colors on a human character, we will help to translate the sickness and the fact that something is going to happen to him and he's not going to live very long. Some other images, so use of everything to support the story. This could look like a very simple image, but we have 4 actors, and the main center of attention is this guy here. So to make sure that we see him first and to make sure that we give him more importance than the other one. First, he is the only one wearing a hat. And then if you look at the suits, he has the brighter one. So compared to these guys, and especially compared to this one, we have a contrast created by having the pool of light hitting him. We make sure that we see this guy first, and we create a contrast with the darker area next to him. And he has he is the only one where the face is being directly lit. This guy is more on the side, but we don't see his face, so it's not very important. But we see his face, and we can see the white beard and the face, and we have this very brightly lit hat. And everything is happening on a darker background. We can see that we have the shadow here in the dark, making sure that we keep a contrast with all this area. The whole area here kind of using the same values and the same colors. So there is not a lot of contrast happening here. There is not a lot of contrast happening here either. The area of most contrast is here. So we make sure that we see the character this way. This is a scene from Black Widow. The purpose in the story is to introduce her. She's a woman killing her husbands, so she's kind of a weird one. And the intention here, this is the first shot where we see her in the movie. So to make sure that we understand that there is something strange happening with this woman, even though all the apartments is being normally lit, every color is very neutral. We only have neutral warm color, neutral red, like some kind of brownish white and beige, but there is not a lot of things happening there. But she is being lit, backlit, just framed by this pool of blue light. And not seeing her, but only seeing her silhouette in this color, which doesn't really has anything to do in this environment, will help to make sure that we give her entrance a strange impression. We give a strange feeling to the fact that this character is going to appear. So it helps the story and the storyteller in making sure that, okay, there is something weird that's going to happen with this woman. Very, very, very simple use of colors in this image. Very big green environment. Just one patch of red is enough for us to look at these characters. So it's a very, very efficient way of using color contrast. Again, big pool of red becomes neutral because it's in the whole images, and we only have one small, green, and we have one small hint of red, which will grab the attention. I'm just going to move forward a bit. Okay, so I wanted to talk to you a bit some of the step-by-step processes in how to use all of this. So this is an image I lit for Toy Story 3. This image, so sorry, it's very bright here, so you might not see everything. In this image, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 characters. So we want to make sure that we read the action correctly. In the story, in the action, what's important is first what Woody is saying. He's the main center of action. He's arguing with the other character, so we want to make sure that we see him first. But we also want to make sure that we see her, because she's the one who is going to do the transition, and she's the one who is going to convince the other characters that he's right. So in order to do that, we have to make sure that even though we understand the environment, we see Woody correctly. So if you look at this image, there is two main light sources. There is the moonlight coming through the window, and you might not see it very clearly, but there is also a bed lamp light. Like the moonlight is cool, and we have a warm red light coming from the bedside. The red light helps to give us a transition from the previous shots where all the characters were into this red light. So we are still using these red lights to give a transition between the two environments. Woody here wants to leave. He wants to go outside. So he's being lit mostly by the moonlight because his purpose is to get out. The room is being lit by the red light. So the red light symbolizes the room, the bedroom. So this character wants him to stay. So she's being mostly lit by the room light. So we have a contrast between the two characters. She symbolizes the inside of the room and he symbolizes the exterior because he wants to leave. To make sure that we see Woody correctly, he's the character, like he is being lit directly on a darker background. If you look here, we have darkened the background to make sure that every character pops out a bit, but Woody himself is being framed. So he's being framed first by the door, like we have this dark rectangle here. So he's going to have a lot of contrast, so he's going to pop out of this dark area. He is being framed by the chair. The chair forms a rectangle around him, again, helping to frame this area. His face, even though is the most brightly lit area in the scene, we have put lines to make sure that, see, when you look at the horns are directing towards the face. This horn as well, directing towards the face. Even the chair legs are directing towards the face. So all these lines create a dynamism, they create a rhythm, making sure that we have a look in this area. And then if you look at the other characters, these guys, like we have this kind of dimples onto the to the walls, like the light is shining through a tree, shining through a patch of leaves. So we have all the dimples. We also have here, I'm sorry, it's very bright, we don't see it very well, but there is this kind of very red stars just moving around like a kid's light. Woody is the only character who will not receive any shadow from the outside. So even though we have dimples moving here and on all the other characters, his light is clean. There is nothing moving on him. And even the starlights are moving on all the characters, but they are never moving onto Woody. That is because I didn't want it to have too much action happening on him. And again, if you look at the characters, so we have the moonlight coming from the top left, but these characters are being side lit, so they don't have too much importance. But if you think logically, this guy here, the Lycon, should be like, she's white, so she should be at least as bright as Woody, because the light is coming from the top left. But I didn't want it to put a pool of light over there, so for her I cheated the light and turned it around so that she is being lit backwards, and so that we don't see her too much. And in terms of your relationship, if you look at the shadows on the ground, every character is being shadowed compared to its relationship to the story. Woody wants to go outside, so he's being lit mostly by the moonlight, and he is only casting a shadow from the moonlight. He is not casting any shadow from the room light itself, only from the moon, from the exterior light. Like, he has only one shadow. If you look at her, she is symbolizing the room. So she needs to have a link to this warm room light, to the bed lamp. So she doesn't cast shadow with the moon. Like, there is no shadow for her here. There is only one shadow with in the warm light. So having this shadow with her helps to create a link to the inside of the room. Having only one shadow with Woody helps to create a link with the outside. And in terms of shadow, we played a bit. If you look at the shadow direction here, it should have cut the middle guy here completely. This guy here should be in shadow. but it didn't help. Like, this guy is as important as the other one, and we removed the shadow on him so that it's not being cut by a vertical line and doesn't take too much attention. This is a scene from Cars 2. So again, lots of things happening in this image. We have like all these screens, lot of buttons, lot of artificial lights. We have these two cars being highly reflected. Oh, by the way, if any of you wants to have a look at the real images afterwards, please come and have a look at them on my screen, because it's very contrasty and very bright there, so it doesn't work that well. The two characters are as important, again, as each other. So we want to have a balance. So what we do here first is that these characters are being lit mainly by their reflections. If you look at Finn especially, even though we have a bright environment, he is reflecting a lot more light than he should be. If you look at the, well, you don't really see it, but if you look at the ceiling is a bit darker than its own reflection onto Finn's hood. And that is because I didn't want it to have, if I had put the same amount of lighting here than here, they would have neutralized themselves. So by faking the reflection and increasing the reflection on top of it to have a more bright ceiling in the reflection, I emphasize the fact that these characters should be the one to be looked at. These characters have two different colors. So in order for me to make sure that we read the two characters equally, we have the warm character here, the purple one, being put in front of very cold objects. So we have the blue screen, the blue lights here. There is not really much happening behind her, whereas Finn, who is blue, is put in front of warm objects, like we have this big wall here and the windows. So by creating a color contrast between each character and the background behind them, we make sure that we bring them forward, we make sure that we see them correctly, but we give them the same importance in the image. Yep. This sequence, I don't know if you remember, it's in Toy Story 3 when Buzz is dancing around Jessie. This is happening in a bush. So if you think about it logically, there is absolutely no reason why we should have any light at all in there. Like, they are under like 2 or 3 bushes. In the previous shots, everything that we had seen there was in darkness, so there is no logical reason to have any light. But in terms of the story, we want to have a lighting. So what we do is that we use some kind of a theatrical lighting to shape the characters. Jessie is the main center of interest, so she is lit like an actress on the theater stage. We have one spotlight lighting her directly. And to make sure that we only see her, the whole background is being lit very, very darkly. We have small details, we have some very high frequencies values, but everything is darker than her. And she's being lit directly by the spotlight, and we also shape the ground to make sure that we ground her where she should be. And at the same time, Buzz, while supposed to be in the dark areas, it still is important. So we have a second spot on him as well. If you think about it, look at the shadows on the ground. The shadows on the ground mean that with the light direction, Buzz should be completely into the shadow as well. But his movement, and especially his face and his hand movements, are important. So we remove the shadow on him to make sure that we can read him correctly. But at the same time, we make sure that most of his body is being kept in a bit of a darker light than Jessie's, just to make sure that Jessie always has more importance in terms of lighting than Buzz. the other reason is that I don't know if you've seen this shot, but Buzz is going completely crazy there. He's going to dance around there, he's going to jump around there, and he's going to take some crazy poses while she's going to stay still. So the animation gives a lot of emphasis to Buzz because he's the one doing all the action. So what we want to do is to make sure by lighting that we increase the interest of lighting on Jessie and decrease it on Buzz to make sure that lighting and animation balance themselves together, and then the shot works and then each character has enough purpose. So, well, it's been 2 hours. It's time already. Well, I don't know if you have any questions. Or look at some images more in detail if you want to. Well, thank you very much, and I hope you have a nice day here at Comic-Con.
โอเคขอเสียงปรบมือให้กับมิสเตอร์ฟรองซัว
Thank
ด้วย
you.
ค่ะ Merci Mr. Francois for the nice presentation and for your guide and recommend for the good career and the good like for the idea for the lighting technique in computer graphic world นะคะปรบมืออีกครั้งให้กับมิสเตอร์ฟรองซัวด้วยค่ะ Thank you very much once again ท่านผู้มีเกียรติคะเดี๋ยว